Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well today, and I hope you will humor me for a few minutes while I sort of rant a little bit about Total War Pharaoh. I'm not going to read through all of this big announcement news word for word, but I am going to kind of give my thoughts, and I'm very curious to see how many of you see it the same way or might have some other insights that you'd be happy to share with me and with everyone else in the comments, because I'm not exactly sure exactly what to think of this game. So we all know sort of the background of Total War Pharaoh, and I really can't give CA the benefit of the doubt on this one. I think we know it was a little bit of a greedy cash grab on their part. I think it's pretty well accepted that the game was originally intended to be an expansion of Total War Troy, that they decided to turn not only into its own separate game, but a quote-unquote full-size historical title as opposed to a saga. And yeah, clearly that didn't go very well, but let's go ahead and let bygones be bygones. Let's reevaluate this game as of this point in time. And so as of this point in time, the way that I'm kind of approaching this game now is I have a fair amount of excitement and optimism for this game. I do not currently own it, but I am leaning towards getting it. And at the same time, I have some reservations about this game, and so I'm going to kind of talk about those. But first of all, let's dive into the news itself, just so that we're all on an even playing field when it comes to what we're talking about. So some of the criticisms of this game. Actually, I'm going to back up just a second before I start talking about that. So I think everybody who's at least moderately familiar with the channel now knows that I'm a huge Warhammer Total War fan, and I have mentioned before, I'm a big Total War fan in general. And actually, my first love is history, and so the historical titles of Total War were what originally sucked me in, and I've been playing the Total War series since the very first Medieval came out, with a couple of titles that I did not pick up because I was out of the country when they came out and I didn't have any time to play video games, but that's all kind of irrelevant to this discussion. But anyway, I really do love the idea of the historical titles. Having said that, I really believe that Warhammer has sort of pushed the envelope in what the Total War series can do. The introduction of magic, the introduction of flying units, so many diverse mechanics across all the different factions. And all that is kind of relevant as we get back into discussing not just Total War Pharaoh, but really any historical title. And so I think it's kind of the elephant in the room to say, has Warhammer potentially spoiled players for historical titles? Now, that's probably going to seem silly to a lot of people because a lot of people definitely prefer the historical titles. And I will say that even I sometimes like to go back and have a change of pace playing a historical title. But I do think that you can objectively say that the amount of diversity of factions, the introduction of so many new mechanics and everything into that game does add an element in Warhammer that doesn't exist in any of the historical titles. So keeping that in mind as we look at what they're doing here, let's think about what the previous, at least what I've heard of as the main criticisms of Total War Pharaoh have been, which is, number one, the factions all kind of play a little bit too similarly. So you're talking about not having a great deal of replayability. There's only so many types of units that you can create that are slingers or basic archers or basic spearmen or basic swordsmen using essentially the same technology across the entire map. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is obviously a consideration. Some people will be turned off by that, I believe. And then the other consideration is just the scope of the game was too small. You cannot have a grand Bronze Age strategy game that only has one small corner of the Bronze Age. So this this news, I believe, is going a long way towards addressing both of those concerns, but in particular the second one, because as you can see right here, you can see they're saying you wanted to see the addition of Babylon, Assyria, Mycenae, and Troy as playable cultures for the experience to truly feel like a Bronze Age epic, which is, of course, true. They are adding new historical leaders, over 150 new and reworked units, and all new campaign mechanics. So this, to me, sounds very promising. I don't know, obviously, any specifics, but if they are recognizing that new mechanics need to be added, I think that will certainly help. I think some additional levels of complexity will help with the replayability of the game, and just quite frankly, more choices makes for a better game overall. So fingers crossed on that one, but it certainly seems like a step in the right direction. Again, they are expanding the map itself. Two major changes that they're saying. To the east, you'll see the lands of Mesopotamia, a region known as the cradle of civilization due to its significant contribution to human history. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say right now, I studied history in college before I changed over to international relations. I studied a heck of a lot of history. The Bronze Age is not really, the ancient world's not really my specialty. I was more of a medieval time period, but this time period is absolutely fascinating. And so color me intrigued on this. If there's a Total War game that is a really good ancient history representation, I am definitely going to be intrigued by that if the rest of the game looks like it's worth playing. And so continuing on this, to the west, you'll see the addition of the Aegean region and Troy, two regions known for the legendary Trojan War, of course. And so much like this depiction of the epic landscape in a Total War saga Troy, the main characteristics of the lands are the Greek islands and the many high mountains and continents, while the climate is dry and hot. So obviously the climate, not such a big deal for me, but it would be kind of neat to be playing in the ancient Greek world because that was such a critical part of human history. So anyway, as you can see, there's obviously a much larger map now. There are more civilizations. Presumably that will lead to more diversity between the different factions, and I think all of that is a really good thing. The map scale, they get into this. It's a 1.8 times larger than the current map, which is good. 168 new settlements, boosting the total count from 181 to 349. Very impressive. And they get into a little bit more of the technical specs here. We have to assume that they will do a good job, technically speaking. Now, since I don't own the game, I haven't played Total War Pharaoh, I can't really speak to the engine. I'm assuming that it's not a revolutionary new Total War engine, but if it plays much the same as Warhammer, then it's going to be what I would call a good, fun engine with flaws. But like I said, at this point, I'm kind of speculating a little bit there because I haven't played it. But unless this comes with a brand new reworking of an engine, then I don't think that we can really count on that aspect of the series getting better with this particular expansion. Obviously, the expansion is also free, which is a really big deal. I should have probably mentioned that at the very beginning. It is very clear that CA is trying very, very hard to make amends for what were not just perceived missteps, but genuine missteps that really cost them dearly in terms of their customer satisfaction, which does have ramifications on their bottom line as well. But we won't get into all that. So anyway, traversing the ancient world. So this is a little bit interesting. Obviously, the traveling by water was extremely important the further you go back in human history. That's why all of the ancient civilizations did form on around rivers. So obviously this being the cradle of civilization, it's a pretty major one. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers over here, the cradle of civilization. Really, for a history buff like me, really, really neat to be able to play a Total War game in this time period, in this location. Anyway, so they're talking here about these sea lanes. This sounds like it would be a pretty good mechanic to me. We know that the sea peoples invaded from the sea. I'm not an expert on them, but I know that there's still a lot of unanswered questions about exactly who the Sea Peoples were and where they were from. I like to think that they're from Spain originally, because obviously it wasn't known as Spain back then, but the Iberian Peninsula. Anyway, that's because I lived in Spain for a while and I have a particular fondness for it. But anyway, they may have contributed to the Sea Peoples. We don't know, or at least I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, having these sea lanes to make traversal by sea go faster. I like the idea of it. We'll have to see how it's actually implemented. I do like the idea of this better than the sea lanes that are being used in Warhammer, where it just kind of teleports you from one spot to another over a period of time. That's not exactly terribly realistic. I don't have a problem with it in Warhammer, but this does seem to me like a better system. I guess I could kind of blow this up a little bit bigger, but so I believe, yeah, this is very clearly all the sea lanes that are labeled right there. So anyway, I think that mechanic will be quite interesting, and obviously gives extra incentive then for the more coveted parts of territory, which would be the coastal regions. And then it says, beyond the sea, we've also been conscious of including additional ways of traversing the world. For instance, rivers such as the Tigris and Euphrates within Mesopotamia will provide strategic value as armies navigate along their banks to attack key settlements, akin to the Nile within Egypt. So I don't exactly know how to interpret this. These lands are terribly valuable. Don't get me wrong. I do believe this is going to be where most conflicts should happen because of the value of the land along these rivers. But it almost sounds like they're expecting the rivers themselves to be used for traversal. And I'm not an expert in this time period, but I kind of sort of doubt that they had really effective transportation of massive armies along these rivers. I think it's more that they marched along the rivers because it was fertile territory. But if I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the comments. So anyway, I'm very curious to see what exactly they mean by this. Other notable curiosities, just to touch upon these, they are adding certain iconic landmarks. I think that sounds quite interesting. Some of these I'm quite familiar with. Some of them I'm not really familiar with. So I'm looking forward to learning more history just by playing this game. To me, that's quite appealing. And again, they talk about sort of the technical specs of how they're going to do all this. And that's pretty much it. I don't think we know yet when this is going to be done. I don't think they would be talking about it now if it was a really long time in the future, though. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing this coming. And like I said, I am actually at this point leaning towards getting this game. I don't know whether I will do much in the way of series on the channel. I might, start with one and see how it does. But I'm very curious if you all have opinions about whether or not you're looking forward to this series and whether or not you think, or this expansion, and whether or not you would be interested in watching any Let's Play series of this particular game. That would help me as well. So anyway, just my basic thoughts. I want to go back then to what I started with, which is I'm intrigued because I like history and because this is a fascinating time period. I don't know how much replayability this game will have if indeed they add all these factions and add different mechanics to make them genuinely feel unique. I think that's going to be great. That will add a lot of replayability. But if they add these factions and you find out that playing the Babylonians just quite frankly doesn't feel all that much different than playing the Assyrians, which doesn't feel all that much different than playing any of the Egyptian factions, for example, it just kind of feels like it might get stale much faster than you would expect from something like Warhammer. And it could just turn into a game that I will dip into every once in a while instead of one that I would play with any kind of a regularity. But who knows? That all kind of remains to be seen. But that is sort of the reservation that I am keeping in the back of my mind. And to kind of expand upon that thought, it could potentially be a problem with all historical titles because there's just a lot more you can do with the Warhammer world, with magic in particular. If they introduce mythology, that could obviously add some new mechanics that would make these different factions play out differently. They kind of did that with Rome, where depending on which gods you worshipped, you could build different buffs for your units with the shrines and the temples. So, I mean, there are definitely some things that they can do, but I'm just going to kind of have to reserve judgment, I guess, until I see just how effective those things are. Getting a particular buff to, I don't know, your fleets as opposed to your cavalry armies, as opposed to your archers, as opposed to your melee infantry, those types of variations from one faction to the next are just not on the same scale as the differences between playing Throt the Unclean and raising mutated monsters in your faction versus playing even another Skaven faction like Ikaclaw, where you're now, you're focused on improving your weapon teams. And so even though they're both the same faction, they couldn't play any more differently for the most part. And let alone comparing the Skaven to something like the Dwarfs or the Lizardmen, or, well, you know where I'm going with all that. The amount of replayability and variety in Warhammer is unsurpassed in terms of the Total War series, and I'm afraid that any historical title is going to kind of suffer by comparison. So anyway, kind of as usually happens with me, I rambled on a little bit more than I intended to. This went a little bit longer than I expected it to, but I am, going back to my original comment, very interested in what all of you think. So please feel free to leave your comments down below. I do read them all. And yeah, I'm kind of curious how many people think that this is going to be a road to redemption for this title versus Too Little Too Late or anything in between. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I will see you in the next video.